Hi friends! Tonight, we're going to step softly into the long shadows of a time far removed from our own. A place where justice did not wear a powdered wig or hold a polished gavel, but instead wore iron shackles and walked atop gallows boards slick with morning dew. This story is not merely a tale of crime and consequence, but a quiet reflection on how utterly unfit most of us would be, were we suddenly cast into the role of a criminal in medieval England. So find your warmest blanket, let your eyes grow, heavy with the weight of history, and drift with me into the village square of another age. There is a silence that lives in early morning fog, the kind that rolls low and thick across cobbled streets, swallowing the footfalls of even the most hurried passerby. It was within such mist, in the small hamlet of Widdershollow, that a man once woke, trembling beneath coarse wool blankets, to the sound of heavy fists upon his cottage door. His name was Alric Weaver, a name not soon to be remembered by bards or scribes, for Alric was no nobleman, no knight, nor merchant of renown. He was a thatcher by trade, his hands skilled at layering golden reeds atop crooked roofs. His only sin, if one could call it that, was hunger, and a single rabbit taken by snare from his lord's forest. To the ears of the modern world, this might seem a small thing, a crime, if one stretches the word, but hardly the stuff of gallows. Yet in the year of our Lord 1323, it was not merely theft. It was poaching, a crime etched deep in the bark of England's forest laws, punishable not by reprimand or fine, but by a march to the manorial court, or worse. When Alric opened the door that morning, he was greeted not by the village reeve, whom he knew by name, but by two men cloaked in the colours of Lord Whitemere, green and sable. They carried cudgels and long spears, not out of fear, but to display that they did not come asking questions. His wife, Edlin, stood frozen behind him. In her arms, their youngest child stirred, perhaps sensing even in sleep that something sacred had broken. "Alric Weaver," said the taller of the two guards, "you stand accused of taking game from the royal forest. Come quietly." It was not a moment of dramatic struggle. There were no cries or flailing fists, only silence as Alric nodded, stepped outside in bare feet, and looked once at the rising sun behind the trees he had dared to enter. From the very first moment, the wheels of justice were set in motion, not slow or ponderous as they are now, but swift, rattling, merciless. He was taken not to a courtroom with benches and robes, but to the manorial hall, where justice was dealt by the lord or his steward in front of the villagers themselves. The process was swift. Evidence? None. Only the snare, the carcass, and the word of the foresters. No jury of peers, no defence. Only the weight of custom, and the lord's right to command. Punishment could have been a fine, had Alric gold to his name, but he had none, nor did he own livestock that might be seized. So the steward, in the name of Lord Whitemere, decreed a public humiliation, the stocks for 3 days, and thereafter a year of servitude beneath the reeve's lash. You see, friends, in medieval England, poverty was no shield. In fact, it made you all the more visible, more vulnerable. The law did not bend for need or desperation. There were no mitigating factors, no long investigations or whispered appeals. One act, one sentence. As Alric was marched back into the square, wrists bound in rough cord, his neighbours did not shout or jeer. They looked away, as if to pretend they saw nothing. To pity a criminal was to question the order of things. And in Widdershollow, order was sacred. The stocks were old, older than Alric himself, made of oak, darkened by time, worn smooth where countless legs and necks had rested. They creaked as he was locked in, his face tilted just enough toward the rising sun that the heat would find him come noon. Children gathered first, then the baker's boy, laughing and tossing a pebble, then the miller's wife, shaking her head. He thought of the rabbit then, its lean frame, the way it had fed his family for one meagre night, the warmth it had brought to his wife's cheeks, and he wondered, with eyes closed against the brightness, if he would make the same choice again. But that was the cruelty of it. In this place, in this time, a choice born of desperation was still a crime. And the law did not forgive. As dusk fell, and the night's dew began to settle once more on the crooked rooftops of Widder's Hollow, Alric wept, not from pain, but from shame, and perhaps, somewhere deeper, from the knowledge that he was not made for such a world. Few of us would be. So, dear listener, when next you imagine yourself in the leather boots of a medieval rogue or a cunning outlaw, remember Alric Weaver. Remember the stocks, the silence, the look in his wife's eyes. This was only a single day, and already it was too much to bear. The village square by day was a place of commerce and murmur, carts trundling over stones, hens clucking from woven cages, gossip drifting like wood smoke from mouths half covered in linen veils. But when the sun reached its noonday peak and the stocks stood occupied, the square became something altogether different. It became a stage. Alric Weaver, bound and bent within the wooden embrace of the stocks, was not merely a punished man. He was a cautionary tale, a human banner held high, warning others of the price of disobedience. And the villagers, for all their muttered pity and downcast eyes, came to see. Not to mock, not quite, but to witness. There was something solemn about it, an unspoken agreement that justice must be seen to be believed. In the mind of a medieval villager, crime was like rot. If not cut away in full view, it might spread beneath the skin of the village itself. Old Mother Thistle, the healer, hobbled by with her basket of dried herbs and stared at Alric a long moment before muttering, "Should have bartered with the swineherd. A rabbit's not worth your name." She meant it kindly, in her own thorny way. Even the priest, Father Anselm, came and stood quietly near the stocks, lips moving in silent prayer. He did not speak to Alric. That was not his place. But he lingered a little longer than he needed, too, and that, perhaps, was its own kind of mercy. By nightfall of the first day, Alric's shoulders ached from the tension of restraint, and his lips were dry from the sun. A boy named Willem, the cooper's apprentice, crept by after dark and whispered through the slats of the stocks, "Mum says she might leave bread on your step when you're home." It was a kindness dressed in secrecy. The bread never appeared, but the whisper alone warmed Alric's heart. What many do not realize about the stocks, dear listener, is that they are not merely a punishment of the body, but a brutal trial of the mind. For hours, long, unchanging hours, a man is left with nothing but his thoughts and the sound of life continuing without him. Laughter that does not involve him, chatter that passes him by. Time crawls when one is seen and unseen all at once. On the second day, the weather turned. A sullen drizzle began before the sun had fully risen, soaking through Alric's tunic and matting his hair against his forehead. The wood of the stocks swelled with moisture, tightening painfully against his skin. Rain, to a man at liberty, was a nuisance. To a man in stocks, it was a misery. A pig escaped from the butcher's yard that morning and ran circles around the square, its hooves clattering on stone like mock applause. Several villagers gave chase, slipping in puddles and laughing. Alric watched it all from his fixed position, no longer a member of the village, but a silent observer on the margin of its life. And therein lies another cruelty, the way punishment, in medieval England, did not merely hurt, it separated. To be declared guilty, no matter how small the offence, was to be cast out from the moral fabric of the community. You could return to your work, to your home, to your table. But something, subtle and sharp, remained, a distance, a hesitation, a silence after your name was spoken. When the third day dawned, Alric did not feel the chill or the ache. He felt only numbness, a soft, foggy emptiness that dulled the edge of shame. The children no longer came to stare. The adults had grown, used to his presence. Life moved around him now, as if he were a statue or a crooked signpost. Still, and unnoticed. At midday, the steward returned, along with 2 of the Lord's men. They bore a key, heavy and rusted, and without a word, they freed Alric from the wooden yoke. His body collapsed to the ground like a puppet with its strings. "Cut! Come," said one of the guards. "The reeve's waiting." Alric said nothing. He followed, barefoot and limping, through puddles and over stones, toward the reeve's cottage near the edge of the fields. The sentence was not complete. The stocks were merely the beginning. For 1 year, an entire turning of the sun, Alric, would belong not to himself, but to the reeve. He would till the Lord's fields, mend the hedges, carry water and wood, and take lashes for lateness or fatigue. He would not be paid. He would not be thanked. This was not slavery, not in name, but it felt close enough. And so the punishment continued, not in the public square, but in the back-breaking silence of enforced servitude. And all for 1 rabbit. You see, friends, the laws of medieval England did not merely seek to punish. They sought to restore order, to reassert control. A man who took from the forest upset a divine hierarchy. The Lord owned the land by the grace of the king, and the king by the grace of God. To transgress against the forest was to sin upward, and sin in this world had consequences. So I ask, you to imagine, could you endure the stocks for 3 days? Could you bear the eyes of your neighbours upon you? Could you return home to cold stares and colder silence, knowing the shame you carried could not be washed away? And even if you could, would you last a year in toil, working for a lord who cared not for your name, beneath a steward who saw your labour as debt? This was the reality, not of bandits and rogues and daring escapes, but of ordinary people who made ordinary mistakes, and for most of us, one day would already be too many. In the minds of those who dwell in modern times, the concept of justice is often tethered to the idea of innocence until proven guilty. We imagine a measured weighing of truth and motive, a solemn examination of evidence. But in medieval England, justice was not so much blind as it was swayed by rumour, by envy, by silence. This, dear friend, is the tale of Maud of Elmley. She was no criminal by intention, nor by nature. She lived in a cottage pressed low against the edge of the forest, where hawthorn hedges tangled like old memories and moss crept slowly across thatched eaves. Maud brewed tinctures, dried herbs, and brought fever down from her neighbours' brows when the sweating sickness came. But to live on the edge of the village was to live also on the edge of trust. One chill spring morning, a baby was found dead, in its cradle. No wounds, no blood, only stillness and lips as blue as periwinkle. The mother, grief-stricken and wild with sorrow, wailed into the dawn. And in the echo of that cry, fear was born. You see, when death comes without cause, the medieval mind does not rest in uncertainty. It searches, it suspects, and it accuses. It did not take long before someone whispered, "Perhaps the child was cursed." Another, less certain, added, "Maud gave her a tincture last week." Then the village reeve was informed, and so began the dreadful wheel of suspicion. Unlike in modern courts, no formal investigators came to Elmley. There were no constables trained in the art of detection. Justice in rural England was driven by community, by rumour, by reputation, and by the ancient law of presentment. This law, passed down through Norman and Saxon alike, declared that the local people were responsible for reporting crimes. If the community believed someone guilty, even without proof, it was their duty to bring the name forward. And if they failed to report, the village itself could be fined. So, when the justiciar's men arrived on horseback a fortnight later, they were not met with evidence, but with names. Only one name, in fact: Maud. She was brought to the village cross, not in chains, but surrounded by whispers sharper than iron. A hue and cry had been raised, and in medieval law, that was enough. Now let me explain something curious, and quietly, horrifying about the ordeal. Before the development of juries as we know them, England often relied upon divine judgment to determine guilt. One such ordeal was the ordeal by water, a test designed to place the soul in God's hands. Maud was given a choice: confess and receive mercy, perhaps a life in a convent, a vow of silence, or, if she claimed innocence, prove it in the water. She chose the latter. A pit was dug near the churchyard, lined with stone and filled with rainwater carried in pails by grim-faced villagers. The priest blessed the water, calling upon God to show his will. Maud, clad in a shift and shivering from fear and cold, was tied at wrists and ankles and gently lowered into the water by rope. If she sank, the water accepted her. She was innocent. If she floated, the water rejected her. She was guilty. You may ask, what manner of test is this? But to the people of Elmley, and thousands like them across England, it was not cruelty. It was the divine made visible. It was justice made manifest through faith. As Maud touched the surface, she floated. Not because of magic or guilt, but because the human body, when tense and terrified, sometimes does. And in that moment, her fate was sealed. A cry went up. "Witch!" someone shouted. Another threw a stone. Maud was dragged from the pit, dripping and pale, her lips murmuring prayers to a God who did not seem to hear. She was taken to the manorial court, where the steward waited with a scroll and a frown. The charge was witchcraft. Though the word was not yet legal in the king's law books, it lingered in village mouths. The crime was likely listed as homicide by enchantment. Her defense was silence, not by choice, but by fear. She was sentenced to branding, exile, and forfeiture of goods. Her house, her herbs, her books of charms, seized and burned. She was given 3 days to leave Elmley and never return. The law had done its work. The village had been protected. And yet, in the years that followed, no other child died. And many in Elmley, in the quiet hours of night, found themselves waking with unease. For Maud had been their healer, their midwife, their whisperer of comfort in times of grief. But fear, once invited in, does not leave easily. So, dear listener, imagine yourself not as a thief or poacher, but merely misunderstood. Imagine your trade, your knowledge, your kindness even, being twisted by suspicion. No evidence, no lawyer, just water, rope, and the uncertain gaze of neighbours you've known your whole life. Could you bear it? Could you face the hush that falls over a crowd when your name is spoken? For Maud, exile was mercy, and still it was agony. In medieval England, guilt was not always about deeds. Sometimes it was simply about being in the wrong place, with the wrong eyes upon you at the wrong moment. And that, friends, is a kind of trial none of us are built to endure. Let us now descend, not into a grand courtroom nor a fiery battlefield, but into something far colder, quieter, and vastly more terrifying, the medieval dungeon. When one imagines imprisonment, visions of iron bars and grated windows may come to mind. But in 14th century England, most jails bore little resemblance to the clean, ordered structures we know today. These were not places meant for rehabilitation or reform. They were holding pits, designed to contain bodies until judgment, or death, arrived. And thus we meet Thomas Bryden, a man whose crime was not theft or murder, but debt. Yes, debt. A matter of coins owed to a merchant for a cartload of barley spoiled in a storm. Thomas pleaded his case. The winds had taken his crop. How could he pay what he did not earn? But the law had no patience for misfortune. To owe was to sin against the order of commerce, and so he was seized. The jail he was taken to stood beneath the keep of a modest castle, owned by a minor baron whose name is forgotten in the chronicles of time. What is remembered, however, are the walls, thick with damp and slick with mould, and the chains that rusted not from age, but from constant use. Thomas was lowered into his cell by rope and ladder, for the door itself was too narrow to walk through upright. The floor was stone, the ceiling low. There was no bed, no blanket, no fire, just straw, rotting from age and mice, and a trickle of water that ran from one corner to another, carrying with it the scent of every prisoner who'd relieved themselves before him. In this place, time did not move in hours. It moved in echoes. You see, medieval jails were not built to house large populations. Often they held only a handful at a time, but they held them for long, uncertain stretches. And in that stillness, a man began to forget the sound of his own voice. Some spoke to the rats just to hear something respond. Food came once a day, if the jailer remembered. A thin broth, sometimes stale bread, sometimes nothing at all. Water, if clean, was a rare mercy. But the greatest torment of all was not the hunger or the cold. It was the waiting. For prisoners like Thomas, who could not afford bail, or who had no one to speak for them, the wheels of justice turned, painfully slow. His case might be heard next month, or the next year, or not at all. He was not sentenced, yet he was suffering. He was not guilty, yet he was confined. The very idea of a trial was a distant bell, muffled by earth and stone. And, outside, the world continued without him. His wife Marion sold their cow to pay for food. His eldest daughter begged alms in the village square. But still, it was not enough to settle the debt, nor to bribe the jailer, so Thomas remained in the dark. Now, friend, I ask you to pause, close your eyes for a moment, and imagine what it would be to sit in a place like that. Not for a day, nor even a week, but for months, with no candle to mark the sun's departure, no voice to call your name, no window through which to glimpse a tree, a star, or the curve of the moon. Your hands raw from stone, your spirit worn, thin, your mind turning slowly on itself. For many, the jail was not a passage to judgment. It was the punishment itself. Records tell of prisoners who clawed at the walls, convinced they heard voices within the stone. Others who wept at the sound of their own heartbeat. Still more who died not from sickness or cruelty, but from despair. Thomas would later say that the worst day came not in the beginning, but in the middle. The day he realized he could no longer recall the faces of his children, only the sound of their voices, muffled like echoes in a dream. And this, dear listener, is why most of us would never last a day as a criminal in medieval England. Not because we are fragile, but because the system was not made for mercy. It was made for memory, the village's memory of who had sinned, and for fear, so that others might not follow. Eventually, Thomas was released, not because his debt was paid, but because a new reeve took office, and with him came a small act of clemency. Thomas stumbled from the cell with eyes blinking at the sun, his skin the colour of bone, his back bowed like an old man's. He returned, home to find the cottage empty, the fields overgrown. His wife had gone to her sisters in the south. His daughters were never seen again in the village. He lived out the rest of his days as a thatcher, silent and alone. Never again did he borrow. Never again did he speak the name of the baron or the merchant who had brought him low. He simply survived. And in medieval England, survival was victory enough. So the next time you think of yourself as clever, cunning, or capable of withstanding hardship, ask yourself this. Could you sit, alone, in the dark, with only the scurry of rats and the weight of your thoughts to keep you company? Could you wait, without knowing when or if anyone would come for you? Most of us could not. Most of us would break. There was something almost sacred about dawn in the countryside, the moment when the mist curled like wool around sheepfolds, and dew caught the last of night's sorrow before being warmed away. But for Hugh Brant, dawn would not come with birdsong or bread baking in clay ovens. It would come with iron. Hugh was a robber, or so the court claimed. He never admitted it, but he was found with a coin purse that did not belong to him, and in the law of the time, that was evidence enough. His story was a familiar one. A former soldier, turned out after the last campaign. Promises of land never fulfilled. Wages, paid in clipped silver, worth less than the sweat that earned it. He had wandered from village to village, his sword dulled, his belly rarely full. He did not beg, pride would not allow it, but when a merchant's wagon passed along a forest path, loaded with bolts of cloth and rings of copper, Hugh's pride and hunger wrestled. Hunger won. He never struck the merchant. He never drew his blade. He waited until the man's cartwheel broke on a root, then snatched the purse as the merchant fussed with his horse's harness. But the merchant saw, and he screamed, and as fate would have it, a pair of king's men were not far behind. By the time Hugh was caught, he had not gone more than 2 miles. The purse clinked in his hands as he was dragged to the nearest manor, the seat of Sir Cedric de Harlow, a knight with a firm hand and little patience for dishonour. In medieval England, robbery was not treated as a petty crime. It was a violation, not just of property, but of order. To take from a man, especially on the road, especially by stealth, was to unsettle the hierarchy that kept villages bound in place. Landowners, merchants, even the church depended on the safety of roads. A thief was a threat to commerce, and therefore to stability. So the law was cruel in its clarity. There was no question of intent, no debate about hunger or desperation. The purse was found on Hugh. The merchant swore to its loss. Witnesses confirmed the chase. The sentence was swift. Hanging. Not in private, not in the night, but at dawn, at the village gallows, before the eyes of farmers and fishmongers and children with crusts of bread in their hands. You see, friends, executions in medieval England were not hidden affairs. They were public rites, meant to teach, to warn, and above all, to reinforce the rule of law. On the morning of his sentence, Hugh was walked barefoot through the main road of the village of Edburn. He passed under wooden beams where laundry hung limp in the fog. He saw shutters close as he passed, some out of fear, others out of shame. A priest walked beside him, murmuring psalms. Hugh said nothing. He had already wept in the night, when the cold crept into his bones and the straw in his cell shifted with mice. Now there was nothing left but breath and steps. The gallows stood at the far end of the market square, a simple construction of oak beams and a single crossbar. A rope hung loose from it, swaying gently. There was no hood, no executioner's mask. The hangman was a butcher during the week, his hands thick with calluses and blood not always from criminals. As villagers gathered, there was a hush. Not all came out of vengeance. Many simply came because it was expected. One must be seen obeying the law, even in silence. Hugh was offered one last word. He shook his head. The rope was placed. His hands were bound, and in the next breath, the crate beneath his feet was kicked away. There was no applause, no cheer, only the creak of rope and the whisper of morning wind. But the story does not end there. For medieval justice, you see, was not only about punishment, it was also about message. After the hanging, Hugh's body was left there, swaying, turning slightly with each breeze. It remained for days. Crows came first, then the flies. Children were warned not to look, but they did. Everyone did. That was the point. Sometimes, if the crime was deemed particularly disruptive, like robbing a merchant on the road, the body might be taken down and gibbeted, displayed in an iron cage at a crossroads, to rot slowly as a warning to other would-be lawbreakers. Such sights were not uncommon. They were part of the landscape, grim punctuation marks in the sentences of village life. And what of Hugh? What became of his memory? Little. No ballads were sung for him, no prayers carved in stone. He was a criminal. His belongings, few as they were forfeit. His name was spoken only in warnings. His body, once removed, was buried beyond the churchyard wall, ground reserved for suicides, outlaws, and those denied holy rites. And yet, one old woman, the widow of a mason, placed a sprig of rosemary near the post where he had hung. No, one saw her. She did not return. Perhaps she remembered a time when a soldier had patched her roof after a storm, asking only for soup in return. Perhaps not. But it is these quiet acts, the ones that defy fear, that keep the past from hardening entirely. So, gentle listener, if ever you dream of living as a rogue in the old forests, of plundering merchants and slipping away like a shadow, remember Hugh Brant. Remember the crate, the rope, the silence of a village that both feared and forgot him. In medieval England, crime did not make you famous. It made you alone. And for most of us, it would break us long before the rope did. In a quiet village, nestled between the chalky ridges of Wiltshire, there once lived a baker named Elias. His bread was golden in crust, dusted in flour, and his laugh could be heard even above the clatter of hooves on the cobbled high street. But laughter, as with flour, can drift quickly on the wind, especially when it comes to matters of the law. Elias was known for generous portions and tales told over mugs of small ale. He spoke easily, sometimes too easily, especially when ale had loosened his tongue. And in one fateful evening, as the shadows of the tavern grew long and the candles short, he said too much. "You think the Reeves books are clean?" he whispered to a group huddled by the fire. "He cooks them worse than I overbake rye." The words were meant in jest, or perhaps not. But in medieval England, accusations carried weight, whether they held truth or not. Within days, the Reeve heard wind of Elias's remarks. An official inquiry was ordered, not into the Reeve, but into Elias himself. You see, to question the integrity of a manor official was to question the structure of the Lord's rule. That was not merely gossip. It was defamation. It was sedition. But the stew thickened further. In searching Elias's home, a steward found a set of false weights, small, barely noticeable, but heavier than they appeared, meant to cheat the scale. Elias swore he'd never used them. He'd inherited them, he claimed, from the baker before him. It did not matter. The presence of those weights, combined with his tongue's reckless wagging, painted a damning portrait. The I. Charge was fraud, deceiving buyers at market, a serious offence, not because it hurt the rich, but because it undermined the market itself, the heart of any English town. The punishment by law was clear: amputation, not death, not the stocks, but the removal of the offending instrument, the right hand. The A.E. sentence was read aloud by the steward at the village cross. Elias, pale and shaking, fell to his knees. He pleaded, not for himself, but for his hands, his livelihood. A baker without hands was as useful as a bell without a clapper. But the law was not built on pity. On the morning of the punishment, a crowd assembled. Not out of bloodlust, no, this was not the theatre of Rome, but out of duty. Children were brought to watch. Men crossed themselves. Women clutched prayer beads. They believed, as many did then, that punishment served not just justice, but the soul. The wound would purge sin. The pain would cleanse the spirit. Elias stood on a wooden platform, his arm tied to a stump polished smooth from use. His shirt was torn at the sleeve. A priest held a crucifix to his lips. He kissed it with trembling fervour. The executioner was not masked. He was not even a stranger. He was the village's carpenter, chosen for his precision. He carried a small axe, sharpened the night before in the glow of tallow light. A hush fell. A nod was given. One stroke. The scream that followed was not long, but it was unforgettable, high, wet, raw with agony. Blood darkened the hay scattered beneath the block. The hand fell like a bundle of dough, limp and empty of strength. A cauterizing iron, heated to a near-white glow, was pressed against the wound. The sizzle was awful, the smell worse. But infection killed more than the axe ever did, and so fire was seen as mercy. Elias was carried home, his face grey, his lips cracked with prayer. For weeks he lingered near death, feverish and writhing. The village priest visited often, murmuring Latin verses and placing cool cloths on his brow. Eventually Elias survived, but he never baked again. He never laughed. His stump, wrapped in linen, became a sign for children to avoid and for neighbours to pity. He sat outside his door each day, a bowl in his lap, not begging. He could not bear to, but watching, silently, and thus the punishment did what it intended. It did not kill. It marked. You see, in medieval England, justice was not always swift, but it was designed to last. A missing hand spoke louder than any proclamation. It made the invisible visible. The sin wore the sinner. There were others like Elias. A thief might lose an ear, so all would know where his loyalty lay. A poacher might lose his eyes, so that he could no longer see the king's deer. In rare and horrific cases, men convicted of certain unspeakable offences were gelded. A fate as cruel as death, but longer in its echo. Why such harshness? Because fear ruled where mercy could not. And because, in a world without police forces, or prisons to house the many, deterrence was worn on the body itself. Imagine, dear listener, your hands bound at the wrists, your mouth dry with dread, as you hear the scrape of the axe on stone. Could you remain still? Could you face the blade? Could you live after? Most could not. And that is why you and I would not last a day as a criminal in medieval England. We are not made for such permanence. We bruise too easily. We break where others bowed, and once broken in that world, you were never truly whole again. High atop the windswept cliffs of Northumbria, where seabirds wheel against grey skies and the wind whistles through heathered gullies, once stood a keep now long since fallen to time. It was there, within cold stone halls slick with salt and damp, that a man named Geoffrey Lorne met his fate. Geoffrey was not a soldier nor a nobleman, he was a scribe. But in medieval England, even a man with ink-stained fingers and a quiet voice could die the death of a traitor. His crime? Whispered words. They say he wrote a letter, one not meant for his lord, but for the steward of a rival barony. In it, he detailed troop movements, shipments of arms, perhaps even the names of men loyal to the wrong banner. None can say with certainty what the letter contained, for it never reached its destination. It was intercepted, sealed with wax still warm, and that, you see, was enough. Treason was not simply betrayal in this time. It was sacrilege, for the king was not merely a man, but God's anointed. To rise against him, even in thought, was to sin against heaven itself. When Geoffrey was arrested, he did not fight. He wept. He clung to the crucifix about his neck and swore he had never meant harm, that he had written nothing but fiction, that the letter was a draft, an exercise in imagination. But the justiciar who read it saw not creativity, but conspiracy. He was taken, shackled hand and foot, to the tower at Dunmere, not the great Tower of London, but a smaller, meaner cousin, one that lacked majesty, but not menace. There he was questioned. Let us speak plainly. In medieval England, confession was valued above all else. A man's guilt, once admitted, settled the soul and satisfied the court, and if the soul was stubborn, well, the body could be persuaded. Ropes, pulleys, stones, thumbscrews. These were not tools of sadism, but of assurance. The crown could not afford uncertainty in matters of loyalty. Better to be certain, through pain, if necessary, than to risk a hidden serpent. Geoffrey lasted 2 days. On the third, he confessed, or perhaps he simply screamed what they wanted to hear. The difference to the scribe mattered little. His hands shook so badly by then, he could not hold a quill. His sentence was death, but not the clean, merciful death given to thieves or debtors. No, treason demanded spectacle. He was to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. Let us not hurry past this. The punishment was not merely death, it was theatre, designed to unmake a man before the eyes of the realm. At dawn, Geoffrey was tied behind a horse and dragged through the streets. His clothes were torn, his face streaked with blood and dirt. Crowds gathered, drawn by duty and curiosity. Children clung to mothers. Men crossed themselves. He was taken to the field just beyond the town walls, where a scaffold had been built, not high, just enough to be seen. First, he was hanged, not to death, but until the edge of it, until the world swam and the blood roared and darkness beckoned. Then he was cut down. Next came the drawing, his body stretched upon a bench, arms and legs pulled taut with ropes. Then the disembowelment. The executioner's blade opened him from navel to sternum. His intestines, slick and steaming, were drawn out for the crowd to see. Some looked away, others did not. He was still alive. It was only after this horror that the heart was cut out, and only then did death come, at last, as mercy. His body was then quartered, limbs severed at shoulder and thigh, and each part sent to a different corner of the shire as a warning. His head was boiled and mounted on a spike above the gatehouse, where it remained until birds and rain reduced it to bone. And yet, despite this grisly end, despite the screams and blood and public shame, there were some who whispered that Geoffrey had been innocent, that he had written a tale, not a plan, that he had been punished not for crime, but for daring to imagine. But in a time when kings held thrones by God's favour and rebellion meant divine wrath, imagination could be as dangerous as any sword. You may think now, dear friend, surely such a fate would not befall me. I am loyal, I hold no plots in my heart. But imagine living in a world where suspicion itself was a verdict, where a jest could damn you, where your words written in private might one day be read aloud as evidence. Could you remember everything you said, everything you wrote? Could you remain silent when the ropes cut into your wrists and the priest told you confession would save your soul? Could you speak your truth with fire in your belly, knowing it would be answered with iron? Most could not, and that is why you and I would not last a day as a criminal in medieval England, because sometimes the crime was simply being heard. In the year of our Lord 1389, a man named John Harrow stood quietly at the edge of his village green, his hands clasped not in chains, but in prayer. His face bore no guilt, only serenity. But the crowd that encircled him did not return his calm. They watched with tightened jaws, fingers wrapped around rosaries, their breath fogging in the morning chill. John was a heretic. He was a weaver by trade, working long hours in the dim light of a candlelit cottage, threading flax and wool into cloth both coarse and fine. But it was not his work that condemned him. It was his words. Words softly spoken at first, then whispered to friends, then written in the margins of psalters. Words that questioned, words that defied. He did not deny God. No, never that. But he dared ask why the priest lived in comfort while widows starved. Why the holy book was read in Latin, a tongue most villagers could not understand. Why the Pope, a man of flesh, could claim divine truth greater than the whisper of conscience. These questions, gentle though they were, travelled beyond his cottage. A reeve scribe heard them and reported them upward. Soon enough, a bishop's emissary arrived from the city, not with sword or chain, but with parchment and pen. They spoke with John, calm and courtly at first. Recant, they urged. You've been misled. John listened. He bowed. He offered hospitality, but he did not recant. And so, the matter passed into the hands of the ecclesiastical court. You see, friends, heresy was not merely an error of belief. It was rebellion against the very bones of the world. The church was not merely a place of worship. It was the soul of Christendom. To question its tenets was to so rot at the roots of every law, every title, every crown. Thus, Heresy was treated not only as a spiritual crime, but a threat to order, an infection to be cut out swiftly before others could catch the same fever. John was imprisoned in a cell beneath the cathedral in Shrewsbury, a low, damp place where prayer echoed off the stone like birds in a hollow cave. He was visited by priests daily, offered bread, water, and the gentle urgings of repentance. He was told he could walk free if he would simply speak the words, "I deny my error and submit to the judgment of Holy Church." But John could not say what. He did not believe. His faith, though quiet, was deep. And so the tribunal passed its sentence. He was to be handed over to the secular arm. That phrase, the secular arm, was the church's way of preserving its own hands from blood. The church could not kill, but it could deliver, and it could watch. On the appointed day, John was brought forth, not dragged, not beaten. He walked under his own strength, barefoot, wrapped in a simple woolen robe. He smiled at the crowd, though no one smiled back. The stake was already built, a tower of dry wood and straw, encircled by a ring of stone. A small iron post stood at its centre, and to it John was gently tied with ropes. He winced only once, not at the binding, but at the sight of a young boy in the crowd hiding behind his mother's skirts. The bailiff approached and read the sentence. For obstinacy in error, for refusal to recant, for corrupting others by word and by example, John Harrow is condemned to the flame. A monk stepped forward. "Last chance. Say it now, John. Say it and be saved." But John only closed his eyes and whispered, "Into thy hands, O Lord." The torch was lowered. The first flames licked at the straw like curious dogs. Smoke rose in a twisting column, sweet at first, like burning hay, then thicker, darker. The wood caught quickly, and the fire climbed. John cried, "Out!" once, twice, then fell silent, his face lost in the rising smoke. Many turned away, some wept, but no one moved to stop it. Because in medieval England, to challenge the church was to unmake the world, and to unmake the world, in their eyes, was a sin worthy of fire. And so, John's ashes mixed with the dust of the field. His name was scratched from the rolls. His family, left untouched, lived in quiet shame. His books, what few he had, were burned. But something lingered. A word passed from tongue to tongue. A memory, a thought. Perhaps the word of God should be read in English. Perhaps the poor were holy too. Perhaps faith, real faith, could live without fear. Centuries later, others would echo John's questions. Reformers, translators, martyrs. But in his own day, John was alone. Utterly, perilously alone. And that, dear listener, is why you would not last a day as a criminal in medieval England. Because even your thoughts, if spoken too loudly, could lead you to the stake, and your only escape would be silence or fire. Her name was Isabel Merrin, and her cottage stood at the far end of the lane where the road to the convent split from the path to the marshes. She was not poor nor wealthy, merely a widow with 2 hens, a goat that no longer gave milk, and a skill for drying lavender so its scent lingered through winter. She harmed no one, yet harm came for her. In medieval England, justice was not always a question of law, but of perception, and a woman, especially a woman alone, had to walk the narrowest of paths between what was expected and what was feared. Isabel had buried her husband 6 winters past. William Merrin, a mason, died in a fall while working on a church buttress. He left her no children, but a small patch of land, and his name, a shield and a burden. For a time, she mourned in quiet. But as the seasons turned, so did the village's opinion. She did not attend church as often as others thought she should. She did not seek the guidance of the priest. She wore no veil, and she smiled, sometimes at the wrong kind of men. There were no crimes, only glances, only questions. Then came the matter of the Reeves' son. He was a brash boy, barely a man, with a fondness for strong drink and stronger stories. One evening, after too much mead, he told a tale in the tavern, of a visit to the widow's cottage, of what passed behind her door, of kisses, of more. It was likely untrue, likely cruel, but it planted a seed. The next week, a merchant's wife claimed her husband had spoken to Isabel too sweetly. Then the miller's apprentice said he had seen her walking alone, barefoot, under the moon. And just like that, a whisper became a wave. In medieval law, there was no formal statute against being a woman of loose virtue, not exactly, but a community had many ways of correcting what it viewed as disorder. And so, one morning, the bailiff came. Isabel opened her door, flour on her hands, a half-baked loaf cooling on the hearth. She was told she must appear before the manorial court, not for theft, not for violence, but for moral disruption. No witnesses, no evidence, only a scroll bearing names of those who feared for the soul of the village. She was not allowed to speak in her defense. The sentence was public penance, and so, at first light the following Sunday, she was made to walk barefoot through the high street in nothing but her shift. A plain linen undergarment that left arms and ankles exposed to the morning cold. Around her neck hung a placard. For wantonness and temptation, she carried a candle, unlit, in both hands, held out as though offering her sin to the sky. Behind her, a clerk rang a bell. With each step, the bell tolled, and heads turned. Children stared, women frowned, men looked away, or didn't. The path led her to the church door, where the priest met her and struck her once, gently, symbolically, with a rod of willow. Then she was led inside to kneel upon the cold stone floor through the whole of Mass, her candle still unlit, her presence a lesson. She was not flogged, she was not jailed, but she was marked. In that age, such shaming was a blade of its own kind. It cut into the soul, not the skin. For in medieval society, reputation was all. Once it cracked, it rarely healed. After her penance, Isabel returned, home. Her goats were gone, taken perhaps by children emboldened by rumour. Her hens had stopped laying, and no one came by to trade or share a cup of small beer. Even the priest, who had once accepted her tithes with a smile, began to avoid. Her gaze, that winter was long, and though she survived, body whole, her place in the village had vanished. In time, a new family moved nearby, and Isabel was spoken of less and less. But her story lingers, as do many like hers, women punished not for what they had done, but for what others had chosen to see in them. You see, friends, medieval justice did not always need proof. Sometimes, it needed only momentum, a whisper carried by wind, a smirk misread, a gesture out of place. And if you think you could walk that narrow line, never offend, never falter, never be seen when you should be unseen, consider how often we are judged now in our time, with all our laws and rights and protections. Now imagine facing it without them. Could you bear the stares, the silence? Could you stand in a thin shift, with bare feet and a candle in hand, while a bell marked each step like a drumbeat of disgrace? Could you return home and live? Most of us could not. And that is why you would not last a day as a criminal in medieval England, for sometimes all it took to be guilty was being seen. It happened in a market square on a Wednesday. The sun had risen high over the rooftops of Stowbridge, casting long gold-flecked shadows through rows of carts selling onions, smoked fish, and rough-wool tunics. Children ran barefoot among the stalls. The air was thick with spice and sweat, and somewhere near the tannery, a man cursed. His name was Matthew Cordwin, a cooper, known for barrels and for boasting. He drank, as many craftsmen did, after a hard day's labour. But that morning, his drink had come early, his temper shorter than usual. The cause of his rage was simple: a cracked stave, a spilled shipment, a merchant refusing to pay, and so, in the heat of his frustration, with a crowd around him and ale still warm in his belly, Matthew let his anger spill. "Christ's bones rot you all," he shouted, "and your damned saints too. May the Virgin herself choke on this cursed wood." Laughter erupted. Nervous, sharp. A tanner nearby muttered, "Hold your tongue, man." But it was too late. A friar had heard. A young one, eyes wide, robes too new, heart too eager. He turned, pale-faced, and fled toward the church. Now, to a modern ear, such words may sound crude, but forgettable. An outburst, a momentary lapse in temper. But in 14th century England, such blasphemy was not merely offensive, it was a direct wound against the sacred. To speak ill of Christ's body, his bones, his blood, his mother, was considered an attack on the divine order, a verbal treason against heaven itself. And treason, as we have seen, did not go unpunished. That same evening, Matthew was seized, not by the king's men, nor the reeve, but by a group of parish watchmen, older men with torches and worn boots, guided by the friar who had overheard. They found him outside the tavern, slumped on a barrel, sobered only by the sight of their faces. He was taken not to a dungeon, but to the church crypt. There, seated before the altar with candles casting shadows upon his stubbled face, he was read the charge: blasphemous utterance in public, in the presence of witnesses, without contrition or cause. The punishment, the priest explained, would depend on his repentance. If he confessed his guilt, accepted penance, and paid for a votive offering, he might be spared public shame. But Matthew, perhaps still wrapped in pride, or in the stubbornness born from humiliation, refused. He would not kneel. He would not pray. He called it nonsense. And so the case was elevated to ecclesiastical court. At the next market day, he stood in the centre of the same square where he had cursed, stripped to the waist with a rope around his neck. His hands were bound. His feet bled slightly from the gravel beneath. The priest, the same young friar, read aloud his words again, so all could hear. Gasps, murmurs, then silence. Matthew was offered a final chance. Recant, kiss the cross, and take a lash across the back as penance. He spat, and with that, the bishop's orders were followed to the letter. His tongue, the offending instrument, was pierced through with a metal pin and clamped between two splints of wood, so that all might see it swollen and still. He was to stand that way until the sun reached its highest point. 3 hours, no food, no water, no relief. His legs buckled more than once, but the bailiffs propped him up. This was not punishment for pain's sake. This was performance. The tongue, the word, had committed the crime. The tongue must pay. When the sun began to dip westward, the splints were removed. The pin, now rusted by blood and saliva, was withdrawn. Matthew collapsed. He did not die, though fever took him for several days. His speech was never the same. He stammered, slurred vowels, winced at consonants. For weeks afterward, children mocked his voice. Some mimicked his walk. Others threw pebbles at his shuttered door. Eventually, he moved away. No one knew where. The priest who ordered his punishment was transferred to Norwich. The friar who first raised the alarm was never seen again. But the memory lingered. In that town for many years, cursing near the market was treated with a curious hush. Men lowered their voices, women frowned, and when ale flowed too freely, even the boldest drinkers guarded their words like gold. You see, friends, in a world bound by faith, deeply, entirely, speech had gravity. Words were not mere sound. They had weight, meaning, consequence. To utter the wrong phrase, even in jest, even in anger, was to risk more than embarrassment. It was to risk the very tools that gave voice to your soul. And I ask you now, could you live in such a world? Could you curb every frustration, every sarcastic whisper, every angry mutter beneath your breath? Could you watch your tongue, day and night, knowing that your neighbors listened not only with ears, but with judgment? Most of us could not. Most of us would falter, and that is why we would not last a day as a criminal in medieval England. For even the smallest words could draw the sharpest pain. In the grey hush before dawn, when frost still clung to the gnarled roots of hedgerows and chimney smoke had yet to rise, a knock came upon the door of a modest cottage in the village of Brackenhallow. It was not the gentle tapping of a neighbour, bearing milk or bread. It was firm, measured, official. Alden Farrow opened the door with straw still in his hair and sleep in his eyes. He was a man of 30 winters, broad of shoulder, calloused of hand, and lean from seasons of poor harvest. His children still slept under wool cloaks by the hearth. His wife, Ellen, stood behind him, already sensing the shape of the day by the look in the stranger's eyes. 3 men stood outside. One was cloaked in the royal colours, bearing a scroll of parchment wrapped in red ribbon, the tallyman. The others wore boiled leather and short blades. They did not smile. The tallyman cleared his throat. By order of His Majesty and writ of the Exchequer, a tax is hereby levied on all heads of household within the 100, 1 groat per man, and 1/2 for every woman and servant. You will render your due. Alden blinked. He had heard of the tax, of course. Everyone had. It had been whispered on market day, hissed through clenched teeth in the barley fields. The king's coffers were low. The lords had dined well through war. Now it was the turn of the peasant's bowl to empty. I have no coin, Alden said plainly. None to spare. The tallyman looked unimpressed. You'll find it, as others have, or we shall find it for you. But there was nothing to find. Alden had sold his spare tunic the month before to buy seed that had not sprouted. His only horse had died of hoof rot. The last of their smoked pork had fed the village priest during Lent. We owe the king no more than we can give, he said. Quietly, we have given all. The tallyman tilted his head. You'll sign your mark here then. Refusal of payment. Alden did not move. What shall I write then, farmer? A pause. Write that I kept my dignity, even if I must eat nettles, to keep it. So the tallyman wrote, with a quill that danced too eagerly over parchment, with ink that stained the name Alden Farrow into the memory of the crown. By week's end, the message returned, not by scroll, but by sword. At dusk, when the sun slipped blood orange behind the hedges, Alden was taken, not by violence, not, at first. He walked willingly, though his wrists were bound with rough cord. His neighbours watched through half-shuttered windows. Some prayed, others turned away. He was brought not to a cell, but to the Manor Green, where the Lord Steward waited beneath a flapping banner. A brazier had been lit, and beside it stood the blacksmith, not for a horse's shoe, but for something smaller. The punishment for resisting royal tax, intoned the steward, is the mark of disobedience. From the coals, the smith drew an iron brand, a simple ring, the seal of the Exchequer. He approached Alden slowly, as if hoping the moment would pass. But Alden did not flinch. He stripped his tunic from one shoulder, revealing a weathered arm, browned by sun and scarred by labour. He looked at the children gathered nearby, and then at the priest who stood silent, hands folded in robes too fine for such a scene. The iron touched skin. The hiss that followed was not of pain alone, but of something greater. The sound of a man's station melting into ash. The wound sizzled, seared, burned its shape into flesh, into memory, into legacy. Alden gritted his teeth. He said nothing, but his eyes burned brighter than the iron ever had. He was released that night, staggering home with his shoulder bound, in linen. Fever already taking root in the wound. Ellen met him at the door. She did not speak. She did not cry. She simply helped him inside, fed him broth, and sat beside him until sleep came, shallow and trembled. The mark never faded. It healed into a ridged scar, a perfect circle just below the collarbone. It was meant to shame him, to warn others. But in Brackenhallow, something strange happened. The villagers began to look at Alden differently. Not with pity, not with fear, but with a kind of fierce, whispered respect. They brought him eggs when they had few, shared bits of lamb from the hearth, and when the tallyman returned the next year, he found not one door open, not one name spoken, not one coin offered. He did not return again, and Alden, he never again left the village boundary, but his name lived on in the mouths of shepherds and washerwomen. His sons grew proud and quiet. One became a steward to a gentler lord. The other carved his father's story into a walking staff of ashwood, carried it with him to London, and never once paid a tax he did not understand. You see, friends, the crime of Alden Farrow was not violence or theft. It was defiance. And in medieval England, that was often worse. To say no to power was to invite ruin. And yet, sometimes, a single no became a chorus. Quiet, perhaps, but unshakable. So I ask you, if your door shook with the knock of a tallyman, would you answer? Would you sign the parchment? Would you give the last groat meant for your children's bread? Or would you speak as Alden did and bear the brand? Most would fold, most would kneel, and that is why you and I would not last a day as a criminal in medieval England, because some scars never heal, but some are chosen. His name was Finn. No surname, no kin to speak of. Just Finn. Small, quick-footed, and clever in the way that only the desperate are. He'd been raised among thatched eaves and market scraps, sleeping beneath carts or beside the hearths of those with soft enough hearts to offer him a night's warmth. At 16, he had nimble fingers, a gap-toothed grin, and a hunger that outpaced his luck. And one fateful autumn morning, in the village of Darnfield, he stole an apple. It was not his first theft, nor would it have been his last. But unlike those other quiet takings, a crust here, a loose coin there, this time he was not alone. He had fallen in with two older lads from the outlying fields, brothers known more for bruised knuckles than blessed minds. Together they saw opportunity in chaos. A merchant wagon had broken a wheel on the edge of the village green. Barrels spilled. Traders shouted. Villagers gathered. The three boys approached under the guise of curiosity. Finn snatched the apple. One of the brothers grabbed a small sack of salted fish. The other took a leather pouch from beneath a half-rolled blanket, all of it done in a blink. But someone saw. A child, no older than 8, pointed. "They're stealing." That was all it took. A shout rose, "Stop thief!" And then, as dictated by law and custom, the hue and cry was raised. Now, in medieval England, the hue and cry was not a suggestion, it was an obligation. If a crime was witnessed, the entire village was expected to respond. Any man who heard the cry and did not give chase could be fined, or worse, accused of complicity. So they ran. Finn and the brothers bolted through the muddy lanes of Darnfield, past the blacksmith shop, past the convent orchard, hearts pounding with the thrill of danger. For a moment, Finn even laughed. He was young, he was fast, but the cry followed them, louder, multiplied, echoing through every alley and stable yard. Villagers spilled from homes, gripping pitchforks, cudgels, anything close at hand. Dogs barked. Bells rang, and feet pounded behind them like a coming storm. The brothers veered toward the wood, but Finn, unfamiliar with the path, tripped on a root, fell hard, and rolled into a ditch. That was where they found him. He was dragged back by his collar, spitting mud and protest. He swore he'd taken nothing but fruit, but the hue and cry had been sounded, and that changed everything. You see, dear listener, the hue and cry was more than a call to chase. It was a social contract, an old one, older than the laws of parchment and seal. It was the people's justice, swift, emotional, dangerous. A man, or boy, caught under its banner was guilty by default. Finn was brought before the reeve within the hour. The merchant, now recovered and furious, declared his pouch missing. The brothers were long gone. Finn, alone and shivering, became the face of their crime. The reeve asked only one question. "Did you flee?" Finn nodded. That was enough. Theft, committed in flight, carried heavier consequences. It was no longer mere mischief. It became felony, a breach of the king's peace. He was sentenced to the pillory for 2 days, and after that, to a year's hard labour under bond. But that was not the cruelest part. Before the sentence began, he was to be paraded through the village once more, the hue and cry reversed. Not a chase, but a display. A sign was hung about his neck. "Thief, I fled justice." His wrists were bound behind him. His head was bare to the midday sun. Children threw pebbles. A washerwoman hissed and spat. Even the priest, kind-eyed though he was, did not speak in his defence. The pillory stood in the centre of the square, 2 wooden boards clamped tight around neck and wrists, forcing the body into awkward stillness. There, Finn stood as hours dragged by, his nose bleeding from a thrown crust, his skin burned by the laughter of those he once begged from. Food was offered only at night. Water, rarely. And in the moments between shouts and thrown cabbage, he had time to think, not about the apple, but about the brothers who ran. They were never caught. After 2 days, Finn was cut loose, but the village did not forget. He became the boy from the pillory, not just a thief, a runner, a coward, one who had fled justice. Even after his year of labour, back-breaking work, clearing ditches, hauling wood, scrubbing privies, the mark lingered. No one hired him, no one shared bread. He became a ghost in his own village. So he left. It was said he joined a band of roving performers, passing as a juggler in fairs across the Shire. Others claimed he fell in with outlaws in Sherwood, though that may have been borrowed from tales meant for fireside amusement. What matters is this: he never returned to Darnfield. Because in a village where the hue and cry has been sounded, the echo does not fade. It lingers, it stains. So I ask you, listener, could you outrun a village? Not just its feet, but its eyes, its judgment, its memory. Could you stand in a wooden frame, with your name shouted through the streets, your limbs stiff, your dignity stripped? Could you live beneath that gaze? Most could not. And that is why you and I would not last a day as a criminal in medieval England. Because sometimes the worst punishment is not what is done to you, but what others are invited to do. In a cottage surrounded by yarrow and marigold, nestled where the woods met the furrows of Lord Everwin's estate, there lived a woman known to all as Mara of the Hollow. To some, she was a saviour. To others, a whisper in the dark. She had no formal title, no royal sanction, no parchment declaring her skill. And yet, her poultices drew fevers from children's brows, and her tinctures eased the gasps of the aged. Her fingers knew where to press to stop bleeding. Her ears knew when a cough meant death. But Mara's gift was also her danger. For in medieval England, healing was not just a matter of herbs and wisdom. It was a matter of authority. And that belonged officially to the church. Licensed physicians were rare and costly, trained in distant universities, quoting Galen in Latin and treating nobles with leeches wrapped in velvet. For the common folk, healing came from women like Mara, women who had learned not from books, but from mothers and grandmothers, from soil and seasons, from quiet observation, and that made them suspicious. It began, as such things often do, with a noble child. The young daughter of Lord Everwin fell ill after a feast, not from poison or plague, but likely from spoiled meat or a parasite drawn from dirty water. She grew pale, then silent, then limp. The family physician, a man of robes and rings, bled her, fed her tinctures of wormwood, applied cupping glass and prayer. Still, her breath thinned, and so, desperate and sleepless, the girl's nursemaid slipped through the servant's door one night and ran to the hollow. Mara came, without ceremony, without coin. She brought warm milk steeped in mint and fennel, rubbed the girl's feet with mustard seed and goose fat, whispered nothing but comfort. By dawn, the child had opened her eyes, and with her first words, the first problem was born. Did the wise woman make me better? The question passed from child's mouth to nursemaid's guilt, to the ears of the steward, to the thunderous brow of Lord Everwin himself. You see, the matter was not healing. The matter was who healed. For Mara had done what the church-licensed physician had failed to do, and that to many minds smacked of blasphemy. If her methods worked without divine sanction, what else might she challenge? What other truths might she bend? The steward arrived with 2 guards, not to thank her, but to question. They asked what herbs she used, what charms she muttered, what signs she drew upon the girl's brow. Mara, calm and open-handed, explained each remedy. No magic, she said, only what the land gives. But suspicion had already taken root. They seized her notebooks, pages of pressed leaves, drawings of roots, symbols to mark what grew in winter and what cured rot in the mouth, and among them, a list, not of spells, but of names. Women who had sought help during childbirth, men who had come for pain in the joints, even a few Reeves' wives who had whispered of barrenness. It was enough. She was arrested not for witchcraft, not yet, but for practicing medicine without license and interfering with divine healing. The church took over the trial. In the cathedral's echoing hall, Mara stood alone, flanked by friars who eyed her with caution, as if her very breath might challenge dogma. She was questioned for hours. Who taught you? My mother. Where are her credentials? She is in the earth. Do you invoke saints? I invoke no one. I listen. They did not like that answer. She was not condemned to burn. The proof of witchcraft was lacking, but she was sentenced to public penance and banishment from practice. Her books were burned in the cathedral courtyard, their inked leaves twisting in the smoke. She was then walked, barefoot, through the town square, a rope around her waist, holding a sign. I sought to heal without God's grace. Some villagers spat. Some wept. Many said nothing at all. She was not imprisoned. She was not hanged, but she was erased. No one came to her cottage after that. Even the wildflowers seemed to grow thinner near her doorstep. She still gathered herbs, still boiled, roots, but only for herself. Once, a boy with a broken arm knocked on her door. She opened it, but behind him came his mother, who dragged him away by the wrist before a word was spoken. Mara watched them leave, and that, dear listener, is the quiet horror of her crime. It was not a shout, it was a silence. You see, in medieval England, power hated mystery. Healing that came without prayer was feared. A woman who healed without scripture threatened more than custom. She threatened the order that held land and law and heaven together. So I ask you now, could you know how to help, yet be forbidden to act? Could you watch suffering and stay your hand because a bishop said no? Could you let a child die to protect your name? Could you bear the burn of shame for doing what was right? Most could not, and that is why you and I would not last a day as a criminal in medieval England, because sometimes the crime is compassion without permission. The cell was colder than he had imagined it would be, stone on every side. Not the clean-cut kind seen in churches or manor walls, but rough, uneven, smelling of wet earth and long-held breath. The small slit in the wall offered neither warmth nor light, only the slow seep of wind and the faint sound of something scratching, somewhere, Osric was his name, 12 years old, thin as a switch of willow, and currently curled upon straw that felt more bone than bedding. He had stolen a bolt of cloth, just one, folded tight and tied with twine, left on a cart outside the clothier's stall while the merchant argued over wool prices with the Reeves' cousin. Osric had watched the bolt for nearly 10 minutes before daring to take it. He had hoped, no, prayed, that it would mean a warm winter cloak or something to sell for food, but his luck had run dry. A boy of 12, running with a bright, blue bundle, draws the eye in even the most crowded market. He had not gone far. His legs, hungry and bare, were not fast enough. The man who tackled him had done so with a grunt and a curse, dragging him up by the scruff like a disobedient pup. He had not been beaten, not yet. That came later. Now, in the dark, Osric stared at the ceiling where shadows made patterns he imagined into beasts, into saints, into stars. He did not cry. Not anymore. You see, in medieval England, childhood was not the shield we know it to be today. There was no mercy reserved for tender age. The law, ancient, unwavering, held that from the age of 7, a child could be held responsible for crime. By 12, he was no longer the boy who stole, but simply the thief. 3 days he remained in that cell. Bread came once a day, hard and flaked with ash. Water came in a dented cup. No blanket, no fire, only his own arms, wrapped round his knees, and the memory of warmth. When the day of judgment came, it was announced not by bells, but by bootsteps. The steward's voice echoed down the corridor, flat as a funeral drum. They took him to the manor, hall. No great court, no learned scribes. Just the steward's table, the Reeves' nod, a few curious villagers, and the merchant who had caught him, red-faced and still furious. The charge was red, theft and flight. Osric tried to speak, to say he was hungry, that he had no father, that his mother had died of fever the spring before, and that the cloth might have fetched enough for a loaf or a place to sleep. But no one listened. Not truly. The words fell into the silence like pebbles in a well. The verdict came quickly, guilty. And the punishment? Public flogging and indentured servitude for a year to the estate's stablemaster, a man known less for mercy than for his short temper and long arm. That very afternoon, Osric was tied to a post in the square. It was market day. Children his own age watched. Some laughed, others looked away. The lash used was made of knotted cord, not leather, meant to break skin with less effort. 5 blows, 1 for the crime, and 4 for his defiance. He screamed only once, then bit down on his tongue to keep the rest in. When they cut him loose, blood ran down the back of his tunic. He fell to his knees. A woman tried to hand him a crust of bread, but a bailiff knocked it from her hand. Let the little thief earn his bread properly now, and so he did. The stablemaster took him in, not out of pity, but obligation. Osric cleaned stalls, hauled water, gathered straw, and scrubbed pails so crusted with filth they seemed carved from stone. He was given only the scraps not fit for dogs, and once, when he was found asleep beside a half-eaten carrot, he was whipped again. Winter came early that year. The water trough froze each morning. Osric's breath fogged the air like ghostlight as he carried hay to horses he dared not name. No one called him by name anymore. He was boy, whelp, the thief. Only the blacksmith's apprentice, a freckled girl with quick eyes, spared him a word, slipping him a boiled turnip now and then, or a kind glance. He never spoke back. He feared his voice might crack like old wood. After 6 months, the scar on his back had faded, but not the mark upon his soul. He no longer dreamed, only remembered. When the year ended, the steward came again. "You're free," he said. But Osric did not cheer, did not smile, did not know where to go. His mother's cottage had long since collapsed. No kin claimed him. The villagers would not house him. He had become the boy who had been punished. And that, in a world where shame outlived hunger, was enough to keep doors shut, so he left. It is said he wandered south, then west, then into legend. Some say he became a highwayman. Others, a hermit. Some claimed he died not long after, his body found in a ditch wrapped in rags and old bruises. But one tale, told only by old women stirring stew in soot-dark kitchens, said he lived still, in spirit, in every child who looked too long, at something they could not afford, then lowered their hand. You see, dear listener, Osric's crime was not theft, it was being poor, being young, and being seen. So I ask you, if you were 12, alone, hungry, could you resist the urge to reach? And if you did not, could you survive the world that answered? Most could not. And that is why you and I would not last a day as a criminal in medieval England, because in that world, there was no such thing as just a child. In the scriptorium of Coldmarsh Abbey, where dust clung to sunlight like old parchment to wax, a man once copied a name, just a name. And yet, for that act, that single deliberate flick of a quill, he was cast out not only from the world of men, but from the memory of those who once called him brother. His name was Warren de Clerve, a lay clerk and former scribe. His crime was forgery, though he would have called it something else, survival. Warren had grown up within the abbey, walls, orphaned at 6, taught to read and write by candlelight, his fingertips ink-stained before his voice had deepened. He had no land, no trade, no family name. What he had was letters, the ability to copy, to scribe, to replicate what others dictated. In a world where most could not read their own names, Warren's gift was both power and prison. For years, he served the abbey quietly, transcribing charters, inventory scrolls, and letters for distant noble houses. It was honest work, though poorly paid. Meals were simple, rooms bare, but it was safe. Then came the winter of 1401. The abbey's granary, roof collapsed under snow. A fire claimed 2 storerooms, debts mounted. The abbot aged and grew absent, and a new prior took charge, a stern man of cruel penmanship and colder gaze. It was under this growing tension that Warren was approached, not by a stranger, but by a merchant's son from the village below. The man spoke plainly. My father has a title deed for his lands, but the charter is damaged. I need it copied, corrected, the boundary line extended, just a little. We'll pay. At first, Warren refused. He feared not only the church's judgment, but the weight of ink used with intent. But days passed. He saw the monks dining better while the clerks grew gaunt. He heard whispers that half the scribes might be dismissed come spring. So he agreed. It was only a few lines, a shift of description, a lengthening of an eastern hedge, the insertion of a witness's name who had long since died. The seal was left untouched. Warren's work was flawless. The merchant's son was pleased. The coin was heavy, and for a time, Warren slept soundly. But parchment, as it often does, finds its way back to eyes not meant to see it. 3 weeks later, a dispute arose between 2 local landholders. The document in question, the altered one, was brought before the manorial court, and something didn't add up. The signature was too elegant, the Latin too polished. A clerk suspected. The prior notified, investigated. And within a fortnight, Warren was summoned. He did not lie. He tried at first to hedge, to claim he had copied what he was given. But when pressed, when the parchment was laid beside his own handwriting samples, the truth spoke louder than denial. Forgery, in the medieval world, was not merely dishonesty. It was undermining the sacred order. The written word was contract, boundary, authority. A false charter could shift wealth, break families, even incite feuds. It was not a private offence. It was a social threat. Warren was excommunicated from the abbey. His name struck from its records. The prior refused him last rites, but the church did not end his punishment. The Crown did. Forgery of official documents, especially those dealing with land, was treated under the category of felony, and often with a punishment designed not just to penalise, but to brand. He was sentenced to loss of the writing hand. The executioner did not arrive with ceremony. He came with an axe and a wooden block, escorted by 2 grim-faced men, and a crowd that grew larger by the minute. Warren did not plead. He only asked for his hand to be wrapped in cloth afterward, not for the pain, but so he would not have to see what he had become. The axe fell once. His left hand was spared, but only so he might sign the confession of guilt that was nailed beside the abbey gate, a warning to all who dealt in ink. Afterward, he disappeared. Some said he wandered into the forest, mad with fever and shame. Others claimed he took passage to the Low Countries, seeking sanctuary in foreign scriptoria. But his cottage remained untouched for years. Books still open, quills scattered like brittle bones, dust gathered, ink dried, and no one dared touch the chair where he once sat. You see, friends, the pen in medieval England was not just a tool of learning. It was a blade. To alter the written word without right was to cut at the very sinews of truth, and truth then was guarded with iron. So I ask you, have you ever signed another's name just to help? Adjusted a date to suit your purpose? Bent a document to survive bureaucracy? Now imagine doing that in a world where seals are sacred, where ink is law, where parchment means property and property means power. Could you lift the quill knowing it might cost you your hand? Could you press it to page with trembling fingers, praying no one would ever know? Most of us could not, and that is why you and I would not last a day as a criminal in medieval England. Because in that world, one false word could take the very hand that wrote it. It was the kind of morning that began in silence, the hush that comes after a frost, when breath rises like smoke and the world moves slow enough for sorrow to settle. Edric woke to that silence. His back ached from a night spent curled on straw, his legs stiff from the long day of ploughing before. He had no land of his own, only the borrowed acres behind his cottage, rented from the local lord for a pittance, paid not in coin, but in hours of work and loyalty. He was a villain, bound to the soil as surely as the oak was to earth. He could not leave without permission. He could not sell, or marry, or bargain beyond what the manor allowed. But he could till, he could harvest, he could hope, and he did. Until the morning the fence broke. It was not a great fence, not even a strong one. Just a series of wooden slats, roped loosely between posts, to separate the edge of Edric's ploughland from the Lord's private deer chase. Everyone knew where the boundary was. Everyone respected it. The deer, of course, did not. But that night, the old milk cow, Edric's only one, had broken loose. Spooked by wolves, perhaps, or by the wind through the trees, she had trampled the fence in her panic, her wide hooves snapping the brittle wood like matchsticks. By dawn, she was found grazing among the low shrubs of the chase, nosing the soft moss near the ferns. By noon, Edric was arrested, 2 men in the livery of Lord Evermere, one of many barons whose power sprawled like ivy across the countryside, knocked on his door and delivered the charge: trespass and damage of seigneurial property. He tried to explain. It was an accident. The cow had never strayed before. He would rebuild the fence himself, stronger this time. But they did not come to hear apologies. They came to deliver justice. You see, in medieval England, property was not merely protected, it was sacred, especially the property of the nobility. And the deer chase was not a casual grove. It was a symbol of status, of dominion. To intrude upon it, even unintentionally, was to insult the order God himself had ordained. Edric was taken to the manorial court the next morning. His neighbours stood along the green, some silent, others whispering. None spoke for him. The bailiff read the charge. Willful neglect resulting in destruction of the boundary between domain and common field. unauthorized entry of livestock into noble grounds, disturbance of the Lord's hunt. The steward, robed and dispassionate, did not look at Edric's hands, still scraped from chasing the cow through thorns. He only asked, "Did your beast cross the line?" Edric, weary and hungry, nodded. "Yes, but she meant no harm." A snort from someone in the crowd. "She's a cow," he added softly. "She follows scent, not law." But the law disagreed. He was found guilty. His sentence, a fine of 3 shillings and 8 pence, more than a labourer's wage for several months, or, failing payment, temporary forfeiture of goods and indenture for the planting season, which meant this: his tools would be taken, his cow would be sold, and he would be loaned to the reeve as a ploughman, to work not his own rented field, but the domain lands of the Lord. He had no coin, no one to lend, and so the punishment stood. His wife wept silently as the men took the cow. His son, barely 8, clutched the broken slats of the fence as though they might undo what had been done. Edric said nothing. The next 4 months blurred into sweat and silence. He rose before dawn, broke frozen ground with blistered palms, and returned only when the sky had darkened to ink. His fingers bled, his back bent, and each time he passed, the chase, now repaired, now guarded, he lowered his eyes. He worked, he endured. And then, one day, they told him he was free again. No ceremony, no thanks. But when he returned to his own plot, the weeds had grown deep. The seed he'd meant to plant was gone. Rats had chewed through the sack of barley meant for spring. There was no cow to pull the plough, no coin to buy one. And thus, what had begun with a broken fence ended with a broken man. He did not steal. He did not lie. He simply lived too, close to the line between wealth and wilderness. And when the line fell, it crushed him. You see, dear listener, in medieval England, intent mattered little. Law was about protection. And the closer one lived to power, the more easily that power could fall upon you. So I ask you, could you guard every post of every fence you build? Could you control the beasts that feed your family? Could you endure knowing that one slip, one night of storm, one frightened cow could cost you everything? Most could not, and that is why you and I would not last a day as a criminal in medieval England. Because in that world, the fence between guilt and misfortune was as thin as straw, and twice as easy to break. The wind blew gently through the narrow lanes of Langmere village, stirring the scent of damp thatch, cooling the coals of morning fires, and carrying with it the quiet hum of something brewing, something sharp, unsaid, and waiting. At the edge of that village lived Alice of Lenton, the smith's wife. Her cottage was neat, the hedgerow well tended, and the door always open to passing neighbours. For many years, she was known not for scandal, but for small kindnesses: a cup of broth to the widow, a soft-spoken prayer for the dying, honey cakes on holy days. She and Willem, the village blacksmith, had been wed for 9 years. He was strong, quiet, reliable. His hands bore the polish of iron and coal, his shoulders the burden of work done without complaint. He loved Alice, or at least, he depended on her, and in the way of many medieval marriages that often passed for the same thing. But Willem was often gone, summoned by lords and reeves alike to shoe horses or mend iron gates in places too far for nightly return. Days turned into weeks, and his cottage sat empty, save for the warmth Alice kept alive in its hearth. It was during one such absence, late in a mild summer, that she began to speak more often to Thomas, the steward's assistant. Younger, sharper, of tongue unburdened by soot or calloused silence, Thomas was a man who noticed when Alice wore her hair differently, when she brought herbs into the square, when she smiled but didn't speak. Their conversations began publicly, then less so. Then they were seen walking together near the hedgerow at dusk, not touching, but close enough that someone imagined it. And in Langmere, what is imagined soon becomes remembered as truth. It was the brewer's wife who first mentioned it to the priest in the hush of confession. The priest, uncertain, did not act, but the Reeve's sister, having heard the same from another mouth, pressed further. Rumour doubled back on itself, like a serpent biting its tail. And then Willem returned. Alice greeted him at the threshold. He said nothing for a long while. The next morning, without warning, he took her by the arm and led her to the manorial court, his voice trembling only once as he made his accusation. Adultery, betrayal of the marital bond, dishonour to his name and station. Alice's eyes widened, not in shock, but in sorrow. She did not deny affection. She denied the act. "We spoke," she said, "but I never betrayed the vow." The court did not need proof. In most places in medieval England, a husband's word, bolstered by reputation and rumour, outweighed a woman's defence. She was found guilty. Her sentence, penance by public humiliation. No dungeons, no gallows, only the long road of judgment, walked step by aching step beneath the eyes of all who once smiled at her. On the first Sunday after Michaelmas, she was brought to the square. She wore her shift only, the underdress of plain white linen, modest but thin. A crude garland of nettles crowned her brow, its sting pressing into her scalp. Around her neck hung a tablet of wood, carved with the word fornicatrix. In her arms, she carried a stone, heavy, not impossibly so, but enough to bow her shoulders and force her steps to slow. A clerk led the way with a bell, ringing once for each of the 3 halts she was to make. At the well, the market cross, and the church steps. At each station, she was to kneel and recite a prayer aloud, not in Latin, but in the common tongue, so that all might hear her plea for forgiveness. "Lord, have mercy upon me, a woman led to shame, and grant that I be made clean in soul and sight." Children giggled. Elders frowned. A few women turned away, perhaps remembering their own mistakes too sharply. Some men watched in silence, not from cruelty, but from the ancient comfort of seeing the law act as it always had, firm, public, and irreversible. At the church, the priest offered her no hand, only a whispered blessing she could not hear for the blood rushing in her ears. When she rose for the final time, knees red and bruised, she looked up at the stone crucifix carved above the chapel door and whispered something that was not a prayer. Then she walked home, but the walk never truly ended. For though she returned to her cottage, it was not hers anymore. Willem had left during her procession, taking with him his tools, his clothes, and their goat. No one spoke to her on the road. The well turned dry when she approached. Even the priest hesitated when she brought her tithe, placing it on the ledge instead of into his hand. Her garden grew wild, seasons passed, her hair turned grey, and still, no one forgot. Once a traveller came through Langmere and asked about the woman with the quiet eyes and the stooped back who spoke only to birds. "She was someone once," the baker whispered. "Then she sinned, or maybe she didn't. But the rope was tied all the same." You see, dear listener, Alice's greatest crime was not infidelity. It was making people talk. And in medieval England, to be a woman whispered about was to be halfway punished already. So I ask you, could you carry a stone before your neighbours? Could you bear the sting of nettles and the weight of silence that never lifted? Could you survive in a world where shame outlived the truth? Most could not, and that is why you and I would not last a day as a criminal in medieval England. Because in that world, for some sins, there was no penance deep enough to bury the memory. In the soft gloom of the village of Grenton, where the smoke of cooking fires curled like ghost fingers around the worn thatch of low cottages, the law walked not in armour or robes, but in voices. It was a world built not on ink, but on speech. In a time when most folk could not write, and fewer still could read. The law was not scrawled in books. It was spoken aloud, etched into memory, and held together by oath. And in such a world, to break an oath was to unravel the very threads of trust that held a village upright. So came the fall of Baldric of Meerfold. A weaver by trade, Baldric was no villain. His fingers were calloused from years of shuttle and loom, his tunic patched, his voice steady. He was known, if not loved, and that, in a village like Grenton, was more than enough. But he was also clever. Too clever, some said. It began with a boundary. Two neighbours, Hammon the tanner and Eustace the beekeeper, had argued over a line of land behind their holdings. A sliver of field no wider than a cart's axle, but valuable nonetheless. One claimed rights by inheritance, the other by tradition. No records existed, of course, only memory, only voices. So the steward summoned the manorial court, and witnesses were called, and Baldric, being well spoken, being someone who had lived, here longer than any save the priest, was asked to testify. He placed his hand on the gospel. The steward asked, "Do you swear before God and court to speak only what is true?" "I do," Baldric said, but he did not, for though he had seen nothing, no dispute, no deed, no laying of markers, he told the court he had. He described a fence post that never stood, a conversation that never took place, a memory born not of truth, but of favour. You see, Eustace the beekeeper was Baldric's cousin by his mother's side. Not close, not dear, but kin all the same, and so Baldric lied. The verdict went to Eustace. Haman, red-faced and near tears, left the court with lowered head and clenched fists. And Baldric, he returned to his loom. He thought little of it. Just a story, a small one, told well. But stories do not end at the tongue. They echo. 3 days later, a girl, no more than 10, mentioned to her mother that she'd heard Baldric practicing his words in the orchard long before the court day. Practicing, she said, what he planned to say, as if rehearsing a tale. The mother told the priest told the steward, and the steward summoned Baldric again. He denied the charge, but now suspicion shadowed him. Then came the final blow. An old woman, once servant to Hammon, came forward with a memory of her own, that Baldric had sworn, weeks earlier in the alehouse, that Eustace would win, oath or no oath. She remembered it clearly, she said, the way he raised his cup, the way he grinned. That was enough. He was called once more before the court, this time not as witness, but as accused. The charge, perjury, falsifying witness under sacred oath, a grave sin, a deeper crime. You see, dear listener, in medieval England, an oath was not mere formality. It was a sacred act, spoken aloud, before God, upon the holy book. It bound the soul. And to break it was to shatter not just trust, but divine order. To lie under oath was to pull the court into falsehood, and the court, in turn, pulled the whole manor down with it. So Baldric was judged. He was not hanged, not beaten, but his sentence was far crueler. He was discredited, marked by the court as one who could no longer swear, no longer testify, no longer be believed. A man who could not be trusted with words, in a world made of words. His name was struck from the list of freemen. He was forbidden to hold office in the guild. And worst of all, he was banished for 7 years from the bounds of Grenton. At dawn the next day, Baldric stood at the edge of the village square. He was not shackled, but a rope was wrapped around his waist, a sign of submission. Around his neck hung a slate tablet inscribed in white chalk, "Perjurer." The priest read a psalm. The steward announced his exile, and no one, not even Eustace, came forward to speak on his behalf. They gave him a crust of bread, a flask of water, and silence. He walked. Where he went, none knew. But stories filtered back. A man with careful fingers weaving in alehouses, trading cloth for lodging. A weaver who never spoke his name aloud, who flinched when asked to promise anything. A man who once, when accused of stealing a silver brooch, refused to defend himself, for he no longer believed his own words could save him. When 7 years passed, he returned, but the land had changed. The priest had died. Eustace had moved. Hammon had lost his sight. No one remembered the sliver of land, but all remembered the name Baldric. He tried to rebuild his home, but no one hired him. He tried to join the prayers, but no one answered his greetings. He died alone, and when they buried him, the priest wrote simply, "No confession, no oath, buried beyond the wall," and thus, a lie, so small, so ordinary, unravelled a life. Because in medieval England, justice did not forget, and neither did the people. So I ask you, now, have you ever shaded the truth just slightly to help someone you cared for? Have you ever sworn a thing you didn't fully know, thinking it harmless? Now imagine doing so, before God, before court, before a village that holds memory like iron. Could you live knowing your tongue betrayed not just others, but yourself? Most could not, and that is why you and I would not last a day as a criminal in medieval England. Because in that world, truth was not an idea, it was a burden. The trees stood silent, unmoved by prayers, unswayed by excuses. They had stood before men came, and they would stand long after, tall, old, and guarded. The forest of Witchmarsh was not just trees and underbrush. It was forbidden land, kept under forest law by decree of the crown and lord alike. A royal hunting reserve. A place where the deer, the birds, even the fallen limbs belong to someone else. But hunger does not heed boundaries. And that is how Tom Hartwell, a charcoal burner's son, came to make his greatest mistake. He did not hunt for sport. He did not bear a bow or snare foxes for coin. He went into the Witchmarsh wood one dusky evening with a sack, an old hatchet, and hope. For his wife had not eaten since Thursday. His daughter coughed in her sleep, thin as a reed. The stores of salted oats had gone to mould, and in the far grove, wild garlic grew in thick green patches, herbs that could stretch a pot of broth for a week. So Tom stepped across the line. There were no guards that night, no dogs, only stillness and the hush of leaves above. He moved quickly, cutting a small bundle of underbrush and scooping wild garlic into the sack, careful not to trample or tear. But the forest had eyes. Some said it was a gamekeeper who spotted him crouched behind a rock. Others whispered of a forest reeve with a grudge. Regardless, the next morning, Tom was pulled from his bed and dragged to the steward's court. The charge, poaching and trespass upon royal forest. He tried to explain. "I took nothing but herbs," he said. "No beast, no branch still living, only what the soil gave freely." But Witchmarsh was not free, not in the eyes of the law. You see, in medieval England, forest law was an entire world of punishment apart from common law. It was harsh, sacred, and specific, created to protect noble game and preserve land for royal sport. To touch, to tread, to take, any of these, without license, was a crime, and Tom had taken. The steward did not smile. "The king's deer need forage," he said. "You take from the undergrowth, you take from them." The penalty? Mutilation. Not execution, for his offence was minor. Only greenwood, as the court noted, but enough for a mark. His right ear was to be cropped, the top sliced off cleanly, so that any who looked upon him might know. This man had once trespassed. The sentence was carried out swiftly in the courtyard. He was bound to a post. The village looked on, silent. A hot blade was used, not to be cruel, but to seal the wound. The pain was quick. The shame lasted years. His wife wept beside their hearth that night, dabbing his bandage with cloth steeped in ale. His daughter, too young to understand, reached for his head and touched the scar with a finger, asking, "Why did they take your ear?" He said only, "Because I went where I was not welcome," and from that day forward, Tom wore a hood, even in summer, but the mark did its work. He was refused entry into guilds. Lads in the village mocked him when they drank too deep. Landlords demanded coin up front. They would not risk harbouring. A marked man. Even the church hesitated to let him read aloud. For in a world built on appearance and reputation, a cropped ear was louder than any confession. He continued to work, though trade grew thin. He sold charcoal still, stacking the kiln, with care, though fewer came to buy. His tools dulled. His hands grew cracked. He aged before his years. Some say he died of a wasting fever. Others say he vanished into the forest again, this time for good. A few whispered that he lived among outlaws, men with missing fingers and branded cheeks, a hidden fellowship of those broken by law, not evil. But the forest remembered, and so did the village. Even decades later, when young boys ran through Witchmarsh and dared one another to cross the line, they'd say, "Don't let them catch you, or you'll end like old Tom Hartwell." You see, dear listener, the trees of medieval England were not simply trees. They were gilded walls, rooted in law and privilege, and stepping within them, even for herbs, even for hunger, was like breaking into a noble's bedchamber. So, I ask you now, could you watch your child cough from hunger, knowing food grew just beyond the hedge? Could you resist one handful of garlic that might save a life? Could you keep your feet behind the line when your soul cried forward? Most could not, and that is why you and I would not last a day as a criminal in medieval England. Because in that world, the forest was not shelter. It was a trap. The sky hangs low over the village, the mist does not rise, and in the hush before dawn, the road seems longer than before, worn not just by feet, but by memory. You are here again, with all that you have seen, all you have heard. You return to the place where the tale began, not with gallows or fire, but with a question. Why wouldn't you survive even a single day as a criminal in medieval England? Now, after 19 stories, 19 voices, 19 shadows cast across the stones of time, the answer whispers clearer. It was never just the punishment. Not really. It was the permanence of the mark. You see, in that world, where parchment was power and breath was testimony, to err even once was to invite a fall from which few ever rose. There were no sealed records, no appeals, no served your time. There was only the stain, the brand upon the flesh, the whispered name that clung to you through every season. You were no longer a man who stole because his child was cold. You were a thief, no longer a girl who loved the wrong soul. You were a whore, not a hungry father who crossed into the forest to pick herbs, but a poacher. One word, one deed, one moment of weakness, and you were changed in the eyes of your village, your church, and your God. Think now of the world we have walked through. Think of Osric, the boy behind bars, bloodied for cloth he never wore. Of Alice, walking barefoot through nettles, not because of what she did, but because someone believed she might have. Of Tom, who lost an ear to a tree that fed his starving daughter, and Baldric, who spoke one lie too well and was never trusted again. They did not murder. They did not rebel. They survived, poorly, quietly, alone. And that is the truth buried deepest beneath medieval justice. Survival was not freedom. To live past the sentence was not to return to life. It was to be caught in its outer ring, untrusted, untouchable, unclean. To be a name whispered when the wind howled, or when the reeve passed and someone spat. To walk a path that never led home. You wouldn't last a day. Not because the axe falls swiftly, but because your name would not rise again once it fell. You would try to explain, of course. I only lied once. It was just firewood. I didn't mean to step across the line, and perhaps the priest might nod, but the baker would still raise his price. The reeve would still watch you more closely. The marriage you sought would vanish, and your child, one day, would hear your name in a story not meant for their ears. Don't be like him. He did wrong. He was punished, even if the punishment was long ago, even if you were never guilty, because in that world, perception was law. and the law never forgot. And so we return to our question. You, gentle listener, who pays your debts, who returns borrowed books, who would never steal an egg or strike in anger, you would not survive the weight of one day. Because even a single misstep, in a world so tightly coiled in fear and order, was enough to unravel your name, your place, your future, not by blade, but by absence. Absence of welcome, absence of trust, absence of being seen. And in that emptiness, what is a person but a breath, waiting to be stilled, yet still, some did survive. They limped through the years, scarred and silent, and watched the sky for signs of grace. They planted seeds no one would eat beside cottages they no longer owned. They held their shame like a wound, closed but aching, and they remind us of something precious. That dignity is not always given. It must often be reclaimed in silence, in waiting, in the dark. So as the night deepens and your breath slows beneath the blanket's weight, let your thoughts drift. Not to gallows, but to green meadows. Not to courts and lashes, but to firelight and the sound of rain on thatch. You are not there. You are here. You are safe. And those who came before, the punished, the accused, the remembered, they are only echoes now. Let them fade gently. And if, by some quiet mercy, your dreams bring you to their time, walk softly, speak kindly, and remember, justice in any age is only as just as the hands that hold it. Sleep well now, for in the world of dreams, the laws are gentler, and in this moment, at last, you are free.